Well, good day. Here we are for our second lecture. We're going to finish up World War I today and kind of finish that off. But, you might be watching this before this date, but when I signed it, it's April 1st. So I'm going to do some stuff for this day in history, April 1st. 1918, the Royal Air Force was founded. So it's founded during the midst towards the end of World War I. Obviously, going to play a huge role, an important role in World War II. This day in history, 1924, Adolf Hitler was arrested for his attempted overthrow of the government in Munich, Germany, and he was put in prison on this day in history. He was supposed to serve 5 years, but he got out in less than a year. We'll go over that next chapter, talking about it in more detail. This day in history, 1789, the first Speaker of the House was appointed. His name was Frederick Augustus Conrad Muhlenberg. That's quite the long name. One of the things that's really interesting about Muhlenberg was he was a Lutheran minister. So just to show you that whole separation of church and state, there were a lot of very strong Christians inside the government. They certainly weren't trying to keep Christianity out of the government. They were just trying to keep the government from running churches. And then last, this day in history, 1970, President Richard Nixon banned cigarette ads on TV and radio. So you could still see them maybe in magazines and newspapers, but they would no longer be on radio or television. Obviously, by this point in time, people were realizing just how bad cigarettes were for you. Famous birthdays today, April 1st, Otto von Bismarck. We talked about him last chapter and even mentioned him this chapter, setting up the alliance system, which partly led to World War I. Obviously, a very famous German leader who helped unify Germany and make it into a unified country. Technically, he was Prussian, but still he's the one who almost single-handedly unified the country of Germany. Susan Boyle, obviously she was on I don't know if it was Britain's Got Talent or the X Factor in Great Britain. I don't remember which one. But she became very famous because people weren't expecting her to be very good when she got on stage, and then she was a phenomenal singer. She sang a song from Les Miserables. Asa Butterfield, actor, he plays in... Well, I can't think of the name of the movie. Oh, Ender's Game, and he's Ender, so he's the main character in the movie Ender's Game. And Samuel Alito is a Supreme Court justice, currently serving now. He is one of the conservatives on the Supreme Court. Our fun fact today, slugs have roughly 27,000 teeth. They routinely wear out and then lose them, but they replace them by moving their back rows of teeth forward. So that's crazy to think about. Must be some microscopic small teeth considering how, slugs aren't the largest animals. Okay, so like I said, we're going to continue and finish off the war today. Technically the war's over, but we're going to talk about the treaty that ends the war and then a few other things that happen after the war's over, some other attempts at peace. So you have the Paris Peace Conference, in which they will produce several documents ending the war, one for each country, but we're going to primarily focus on the Treaty of Versailles, which is the one that deals with Germany. They had other treaties in place to deal with Austria and with the Ottoman Empire. So as you come into this, there are three major leaders who come into the Paris Peace Conference. The first one is President Woodrow Wilson of the United States. He didn't actually send someone. He actually came himself. He felt it was important enough that he would go himself. He would spend quite several months outside the United States for this, which was unheard of at that point in time in history. At that point in time in history, presidents rarely left the country, and if they did, it was briefly, but he leaves for months here. His goal is to get the 14 points put into the Treaty of Versailles. We'll look at that here in a second. Georges Clemenceau from France, he's the Premier of France, so the leader there in France. David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. He comes here as well. And then the last one was the Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando from Italy. He, of these four, probably is the one that has the least voice. In fact, he's going to get very little of what he wants, which is going to be a problem for Italy after this is over. So, what happens during this conference is going to be partly led by these four individuals, especially Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd. So Wilson, like I said, was a relatively moderate settlement that he was looking for. He was looking for his 14 points to get adopted. And like I said in last lecture, these would be fairly forgiving to the Germans. They still would lose some things, but overall, the Germans weren't going to be punished really severely. They were going to be punished somewhat, but not overly punished. And the Germans were pretty much okay with the 14 points and would have probably gone along with the peace agreement. Well, they're going to go along with it either way, but they would have really not been that unhappy if they had got something like Wilson's 14 points. Unfortunately, George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George are the ones who get more of what they want out of this deal. George and Lloyd George and Clemenceau, both wanted to see Germany punished pretty severely. Now, France, under Clemenceau, wants to see them punished even more. They want to take land from them, take their resources from them, make them pay things back. And the British are kind of in agreement on a lot of those things, but the British do want to keep positive trade relations going with Germany, so they weren't quite as much for taking away the ability to trade with the Germans, and they weren't looking to maybe punish them as severely as France. So Clemenceau and George especially, they also aren't that happy with Wilson. They felt like Wilson came in and Wilson they felt like he had like this attitude like, I'm very important. Now, Wilson was praised when he came into Europe. He visited a few places, then he came to Paris, and people were lined up on the streets clapping for him. It's almost like there was a parade for him. So he actually was very welcomed by not just Americans, but by Europeans who also were looking forward to some of the leadership that Wilson would have. Now, Wilson's not going to get a lot of what he wanted. He's going to lose out on several things. But he has a particular thing he wants the most, and we'll look at that here in a while. So what does happen to Germany? Okay, so Germany is going to lose parts of their territory. Okay, so they're going to have territorial provisions put upon them. So I'll start with the second one, actually. They lose all of their colonies, obviously outside of Europe. This would mostly be territories inside of Africa. They also lose some smaller amounts of land in Belgium and Denmark. They also have to return Alsace and Lorraine to France. Now, this is partly not unexpected. In fact, even Wilson was on board with them losing Alsace and Lorraine because at one point in time, Alsace and Lorraine was a part of France in the first place. Germany took it from them in the 1870s when Otto von Bismarck, who we just mentioned, was the chancellor. So in some ways, this was already land that the French had controlled for a majority of history. So that part made sense that they would give that back. Clemenceau originally demanded that all German territory west of the Rhine River come under French control, but the United States and Britain did not agree to that demand. So what happened instead was they agreed to jointly occupy the Rhineland. Okay, so first question I want you to answer is what land was jointly occupied by France and Germany after World War I? And it is the Rhineland. If you don't know how to spell that, it is in your book on page 536. In the east, the treaty reestablished an independent Poland. Okay, and interestingly, I don't have a map up here, and I'm not going to go grab the map, but interestingly, there would be a part of Germany that would be separate from the other parts of Germany because Poland would get a part of the land so they could have access to the sea. So there would be a section of Germany that would be kind of cut off and isolated from the main part of Germany. The territory became known as the Polish Corridor, where there was that land in between the two different parts of Germany. A portion of the coal-rich province of Silesia went to Poland. Lithuania received the German port of Memel. In addition, Germany lost all of their Asian and African colonies, like I had just said. In all, the Germans lost 25,000 square miles of territory inhabited by 6 million people. This is just the first of the many provisions, so you can see how this would greatly affect Germany. Economic provisions specified that a large amount of coal from German mines had to be sent to several allied nations for 10 years. Okay, and at this point in time, coal was still one of the most important commodities in the world. It's still important today, but back then it was especially important. Many power plants still worked off coal. Even though you were starting to make a transition into more diesel engines, maybe as far as trains, you still had coal being used for that as well. Even some of the ships they would be using would still be using coal. So coal would be an incredibly precious commodity. And the Germans have to give a good amount of that for 10 years to the Allied nations to help them rebuild. They also were required to turn over many of their merchant ships and fishing vessels to the Allies, so basically give their ships to the Allies. In addition, they had to build new ships for the Allies. The most damaging part, however, of the economic part of the treaty was the Germans were required to pay reparations for the war. This basically means they were to pay for the damages of the war and pay different countries different amounts of money. Now, the immediate payment was $5 billion, which back then was a huge amount, but they would actually decide upon a larger amount later. Germany did not pay this off completely until, if I remember right, it's 2009. So it took them that long to pay this off. It was not something they were able to pay off quickly. Military provisions. Okay, so with military provisions, they basically wanted to limit the military power that Germany could have. Germany, I mean, you got to think about it, with as many countries as they were fighting against in World War I, they did amazingly well. So they had an incredibly powerful army, especially, and they wanted to limit that. So first off, there was a demilitarized zone. This would be the Rhineland. That area could not have troops from either France or Germany, and that was to remain neutral. Now, people from France or Germany could live in the area. There just couldn't be any soldiers in the area. They were only allowed a military of 100,000 men, an army of 100,000 men. They could have no tanks or large guns, so those big Bertha guns the Germans were using are no longer something they can use as well. They could have no submarines. Now, they could have a navy, but they could only have 6 warships total. Remember that one battle we talked about, the Battle of Jutland? The Germans lost 11 ships in that battle alone, and the British lost 15. But now they're saying the Germans can only have 6 total ships in their entire navy. They also can have no military aircraft. Now, they can have planes for commercial purposes, but they cannot have any military aircraft. All military aircraft had to be destroyed, and they could build no more. So even though the military aircraft they already had to be destroyed. So that's pretty incredible limitations on their military. Also, there was the war guilt clause. And this, in some ways, is almost the worst part of this treaty. Considering how bad this treaty is, it's amazing to think there could be something worse. But the war guilt clause basically said that Germany was at fault for the war, that World War I was Germany's fault. That they were the ones who escalated it, and they were the ones who deserved to take all of the blame. Not part of the blame, all of the blame. Now, we go back to the beginning of the war. Germany did somewhat escalate it. There is no denying that. But Germany was not the first one to declare war. That was Austria and Serbia having their issues. So you have this issue, and then Germany did declare war on Russia and France, but remember it's because Russia and France mobilized, and Germany felt threatened because they had enemies on both sides, so they kind of felt like they had to go on the offensive. Now, I'm not going to say Germany didn't do some things, but to deserve all the blame is a big slap in the face. I mean, this would be very disheartening for the German people, and something they would not like at all about this treaty. One of those people would be Adolf Hitler. He definitely doesn't like any of these provisions, but he especially doesn't like that one. I will say there's a misspelling here. I just noticed it right now. But Germany initially refused to sign the treaty. Now, Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire actually weren't able to have representatives here at the Treaty of Versailles. Meaning, when they were making these deals on what this treaty would look like, Germany had no say in it. They basically were brought in at the end, and they were told, here's a document, here's what it says, here's all the provisions, you have to sign. At first, Germany protests. Their leaders are like, we do not want, this is supposed to be protest, not protest. We do not want to sign this document. We feel it punishes us too much. But they are basically made to sign. The Allies say, we'll go to war if you don't sign. Basically, we will continue to fight against you. And by this point in time, the German spirit has been broken. Germany knows it would not stand a chance. So they didn't actually put a gun to their head literally, but figuratively, they pretty much had a gun put to their head, and they had to sign this document. Obviously, this would anger a great deal of the German people, or just make them so discouraged. Let's deal with one other treaty here. The Treaty of Saint-Germain. I'm not going to go through a lot of this, actually. I want to touch on one thing. This is the one that deals with Austria. There were other treaties signed with Hungary and Bulgaria, and with the Ottoman Turks. Of course, the Ottomans kind of fade away after this time period anyway. That's a treaty that is on the next one, but I'm not going to even spend much time on it, so we'll go through it really fast. I do want to touch on this one thing, the concept of Anschluss. Okay, this was the treaty with Austria, and basically it forbid Austria and Germany from ever unifying. So Anschluss is what that means, German and Austrian unification, and that was forbidden for the Austrians. Now I bring this up because we'll get to it in a couple chapters. Actually, we'll hit on it next chapter before the war begins, but if anybody's ever seen the movie The Sound of Music, Austria and Germany unified. And that's what the event that takes place in the movie, The Sound of Music, which is based on a real family. Now, I doubt they ran around singing songs, running around hills and stuff like that, and basically lived a life just like was in the movie. But they wanted to make Captain Von Trapp join the Navy for Germany and Austria combination, so the Nazis, and they refused. That's a real story. But this is when Germany put Austria under their control. That was forbidden, though, according to the treaty with Austria. Like I said, there was a treaty with the Ottoman Turks, but I'm actually not going to require you to know a whole lot about this one. So, obviously they lose territory. They maintain what is really Turkey today. Their Arabian territories, however, such as Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, came under British and French control. They lost a lot of things, so and they lost a lot of their access to some of the ports that they used to have. So that's a pretty big deal. Now, here's why Woodrow Wilson was willing to not get a lot of his 14 points. He was willing to compromise a lot because he actually saw how bad this treaty might end up because of how badly the Germans were going to be treated. However, he felt like if you could create an international organization to try to achieve peace and security, and this would be the League of Nations. Don't confuse that with the United Nations. They are different, although they're similar. This would be the League of Nations. He was okay to compromise and not get all of his 14 points as long as he got the League of Nations. And he felt the purpose here was this could achieve international peace and security. So even though he didn't get the other 14 points, he felt like this could help correct some of those things over time. Now, there are going to be reasons why the League of Nations is very ineffective. It's an ultimate failure. Interestingly, I know it's hard to say the United Nations is an ultimate failure today, because I don't think it's an ultimate failure. But I don't think the United Nations is much better, to be honest with you. We just haven't had someone quite like Hitler since the development of the United Nations to challenge its system. So for one, it lacks authority. So they could try to persuade, and this is going to be the same thing as ineffective, but in the future, people like Mussolini, Hitler, Tojo from Japan, they're going to start breaking some of their treaties, they're going to start rearming, and basically all the League of Nations can do is say, not you guys can't do that, stop doing that. How much does someone like Hitler or Stalin or Mussolini or any of those people care about what the League of Nations is telling them to do? They really don't care. Okay, so they are going to ignore most of what the League of Nations sets down. On top of that, the decisions required unanimous approval during this time period. Now, that is not technically the case today for the United Nations, so that part is better. But you're not going to get nations to all agree on a lot of different things. Okay, that would be very hard. Also, an important part to the League of Nations, and this is very different. The United Nations, America is a big part. The United States did not join the League of Nations. That's interesting considering Woodrow Wilson was the one who was pushing for it more than anyone else. But Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. He took 0 Republicans with him on his journey to Versailles. He did not get their input at all on the treaty. He did not get their input on the League of Nations. He comes back to the United States, and the Republicans control the Senate and the House of Representatives. They don't like what Wilson's peace plan is. Partly they feel like this gets America too involved in international politics. Now, the Republicans are willing to pass the Treaty of Versailles if there's a few amendments to it, a few changes. Woodrow Wilson refuses to make those changes. He then goes out trying to speak across the United States to try to get public support in his favor, and he ends up suffering a stroke. And Woodrow Wilson's never the same since. He literally ends his presidency the last year and a half or so, pretty incapacitated. Few Americans knew just how bad it was, but he basically isn't around the country. The vice president is, his wife's doing a lot of the work as well, and other people are picking up the slack. However, because of that, the United States never joined the League of Nations, and the United States had to create a separate peace treaty with Germany, and weren't technically someone who signed on to the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, reparation provisions. Well, this is something we're going to get to in a lot more detail next chapter. But the initial amount that needed to be paid was $5 billion. They eventually settled on an additional $32 billion, which was a huge amount of money. The Germany is going to be struggling a great deal during this time period after the war. Their economy is going to be crashed for years and years, meaning things just are really, really bad. We'll get to details of that next chapter. But there's times when Germany stops paying because they just can't afford it. In response, France actually invaded the Ruhr, which was a region on the border there with Germany and France. The French eventually withdrew, and some countries, like the British and Americans, were opposed to the French invasion, so that's part of why they withdrew. Because the British and the Americans, although the British did punish Germany quite a bit, they weren't as angry as the French. The war didn't take place in Great Britain or America. It took place mostly in France, so the French were more angry. But the Americans and British were more understanding of Germany's inability to pay these things back right away. One plan that was adopted was proposed by an American, Charles Dawes. There is a good picture of it in your book on page 541. Realizing Germany's financial problems, an American banker, Charles Dawes, formed a committee in 1924 to find a solution to help Germany pay back their debt. So this plan basically said that the United States would loan money to Germany to help them rebuild their economy, to get back on track, so that then they eventually could pay France and Great Britain and even the United States some of the money they owed. So it creates this circle. The problem is, what happens is Germany, instead of using that money to rebuild their country, they use that money to start paying back debts. So Germany gets the money from the United States, it then goes to France, comes back to the United States and Britain, kind of goes in a circle. So we're loaning money to Germany, and a lot of that money ends up back in the United States. So it's kind of a circular flow of money, and it really doesn't make any sense that we'd be loaning them money for that. Owen Young, an American lawyer, devised another plan to reduce the amount of reparations and gave Germany until 1988 to complete their payments. Herbert Hoover in 1931 advocated a one-year moratorium, or basically suspension of payments for a time period. Obviously, there were a great deal of war debts. Germany is going to go quite a while without paying. Obviously, when Hitler takes over, eventually he stops paying. It says Germany never resumed payments. That's not entirely true. They did resume them quite a bit later. But they have, by this time and period today, they have paid off their war payments. I went too far. It's not on where I want it at all. There we go. Britain and France also had war debts to the United States. That's part of that Dawes plan. They they take some of the money they're getting from Germany and pay it to the United States. So it's kind of a really weird cycle that continues to go on during this time period. A few other ones. I'm not going to talk about all of these in great detail, and there's not that much here anyway. The Locarno Pact, okay, was one of those that was passed. I'm not going to even concentrate on that one. I'm going to concentrate on the other two, and then we'll be finished today. So there's one more slide after this. I do want to talk about the Washington Naval Conference. This was a meeting between the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And it was an agreement of how to do your warships. This would mostly be battleships that would be involved in this particular discussion. Well, and it's a weird thing. So basically, the British and Americans would be allowed larger navies than the rest of the world. And these 5 countries agreed to this at this point in time. Now, you might be like, why wasn't Germany invited to this one? Well, technically, Germany was not supposed to have any navy, so that's why they weren't invited. But basically, for every 5 tons of ships, battleships primarily, that the United States and the British have, okay, Japan could have 3 tons, and Italy and France could have 1.5 tons per 5 tons that the U.S. and the British have. Okay, now, flaws in this, because this pretty much only includes battleships. It doesn't really affect destroyers and cruisers and other ships. So what Japan did was they built a lot of cruisers and destroyers instead of battleships, on top of the fact that eventually in the 1930s, Japan's going to kind of stop abiding by this rule. But they did agree to this for the time period, kind of a limiting of the size of navies and trying to maintain kind of the way things were at that point in time. That way, no one would feel challenged about their naval superiority. All right, the next one was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This was an effort to preserve peace after World War I. Frank Kellogg, an American Secretary of State, worked with Aristide Briand, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and proposed an agreement calling upon nations of the world to renounce offensive war. Now, basically, this made war illegal. And you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, basically, you weren't supposed to declare war. That was an illegal action. Here's the problem. If someone does this and breaks this law, what do you have to do? You have to fight back. You have to declare war yourself. Now, they did say offensive war, so if you're the one who's the instigator, the one who starts it all, but you get leaders like Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Tojo in Japan. You could even think of some leaders alive today. Many of them don't care about rules like this. Okay, so this is kind of it's nice in principle. They're saying let's settle things through discussions and through treaties instead of through war, and that sounds nice, but sometimes that doesn't work. Sometimes war is necessary, especially in stopping those that actually declare war or are being especially violent to other nations or even their own people. All these pacts turn out to be failures. They all don't solve the problem. And as far as the Treaty of Versailles goes, it is honestly one of the worst, if not the worst treaty ever made in the history of the world. It is that bad. So that's it for today. We finished this chapter. We will be having a test on Friday. I will have told you how we're doing that by the time you see this video. We'll talk about that during the Tuesday meeting and how that will look. So thanks. Hope you guys are all doing well. I'll sign off right now. Have a great day, a great rest of your week, and I hope you guys are doing well.